The carriage rocked to a stop outside Ashford House, and Margaret Whitmore sat frozen inside it, her gloved hands clenched so tightly in her lap that she could feel her own pulse hammering through the leather. She had rehearsed the words a dozen times on the ride from Whitmore Hall. She had told herself that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. And yet now, staring up at the towering grey facade of the most feared man in Yorkshire, every rehearsed sentence dissolved into silence. Duke Ashford did not receive visitors after dark. He did not receive visitors at all, if the whispers were true, not since he had ruined 3 men in Parliament with nothing more than a folder of documents and a voice that never rose above a murmur. Men called him cold. Women called him worse, when their fathers weren't listening. Nobody, in 5 years, had dared ask him for anything. Margaret was about to become the first. The butler led her into a study lined floor to ceiling with ledgers, and there he stood, tall, unmoving, a man carved from the same granite as his reputation. He did not offer her a seat. "Lady Whitmore," he said. "This is an unusual hour." She forced her spine straight, though her voice nearly broke on the first word. "Your Grace. I have come to ask you to marry me." Something shifted behind his eyes, not shock, not amusement. Something far more unreadable. The silence stretched long enough that Margaret feared she had ruined herself for nothing. Then the Duke stepped forward, studying her the way a man studies a ledger that does not balance. "Marry you," he repeated quietly. "Tell me why." She told him, Pembroke, the debts, the wedding arranged for the following month to a man twice her age who would finish what her guardian had started stripping from her. When she finished, the Duke was silent for a long moment. Then he said 5 words that would change everything. "I will do it." Margaret had expected many things from that room, a cold dismissal, a mocking laugh, perhaps pity dressed up as courtesy. She had not expected agreement, and certainly not delivered with the flat, unbothered ease of a man accepting a business proposal. "You'll," she started, then stopped, because she did not trust her own voice to finish the sentence without shaking. "I will marry you," the Duke said again, as though the words required no further explanation. "There are conditions." "But yes." "Your Grace, you don't even know me." "I know enough." He moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, studying the dark grounds beyond the glass as though the answer to some private calculation lay out there in the dark. "I know your father was Baron Whitmore, and that his estate passed into the hands of Lord Pembroke upon his death, under terms that were never fully explained to you. I know you are 23 years old, unmarried by circumstance rather than choice, and that within 4 weeks you are to be wed to Sir Edmund Carew, a man 40 years your senior with 3 grown daughters who despise the idea of a stepmother younger than themselves." Margaret's mouth had gone dry. "How do you know all of that?" "Because I make it my business to know things, Lady Whitmore. It is, by all accounts, why people fear me." There was no cruelty in the way he said it, only a plain, weary honesty, as if the reputation exhausted him more than it satisfied him. He turned from the window at last. "I will marry you within the fortnight, quietly, by special license. In return, you will live here, as my wife in name, and you will ask no questions about matters that do not concern you. And if I refuse those terms? Then I imagine Sir Edmund Carew is still available." It was not said unkindly, but it landed like a slap all the same, a reminder of exactly how few choices remained to her. Margaret studied him, searching his face for the trap she was certain must be hidden somewhere in this arrangement. Men like the Duke of Ashford did not offer rescue without cost. Everyone in Yorkshire knew that. "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly. "What do you gain from marrying a woman with no fortune and no family name worth protecting?" Something flickered across his expression, gone before she could name it. "Let us say I have my reasons, and that they are not unkind ones." It was not an answer. But it was, she realized, the only one she was going to receive tonight. 2 days later, Clara Hastings arrived at Whitmore Hall breathless with the news travelling through every drawing room in the county, that the coldest man in England had agreed, without hesitation, to marry a penniless lady he had met only once. Margaret, Clara said, gripping her hands, what have you done? Margaret looked toward the window, toward the direction of Ashford House, and found she did not entirely know the answer herself. The wedding took place on a grey Thursday morning, in a small chapel on the far edge of the Ashford estate, attended by no more than 6 witnesses. Margaret wore a gown borrowed from Clara, and her hands trembled so badly during the vows that the Duke, without a word, steadied them with his own. It was the first time he had touched her. Afterward, Ashford House became her home in every sense but the one that mattered. She was given her own wing, her own staff, a generous allowance, and a husband who was, by all outward appearances, a perfect stranger who happened to share her surname. He was polite at dinner. He was absent for long stretches during the day, closeted in his study with men Margaret did not recognize, solicitors, she assumed, or men of business. She told herself she did not care to know more. She told herself this arrangement was a rescue, nothing more, and that gratitude did not require curiosity. But gratitude, she discovered, had a way of curdling into something else entirely when a man was kind to her without ever explaining why. It was Clara who first noticed the strangeness of it. He asked after your father's old estate records, Clara said one afternoon, over tea in the garden. The housekeeper heard him asking your maid whether any of your father's papers survived the transfer to Pembroke. Margaret set down her cup. Why would he want those? I don't know. But it isn't the first odd thing, is it? Clara's eyes were sharp with the particular suspicion of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated by men who assumed she wasn't listening. Twice now I've seen the same solicitor leave his study, Mr. Denby, the one who handles fraud cases for the Yorkshire Assizes. Why would a duke need a fraud solicitor unless? Unless what? Clara didn't finish. She didn't need to. That evening, Margaret found herself lingering outside her husband's study long after she should have retired. The door was not quite closed. Through the gap, she heard voices, the Duke's low and controlled, and another man's, unfamiliar, tense with the particular anxiety of a man delivering bad news to someone who did not tolerate it well. 3 estates confirmed now, Your Grace, all under Pembroke's guardianship, all showing the same pattern. Assets undervalued on paper, then sold below market to companies that trace back to him within 2 or 3 transactions. Whitmore's estate fits the pattern exactly. Margaret's breath caught. And the marriage settlement Pembroke arranged for Sir Edmund Carow, the Duke asked. Would have transferred what remains of the Whitmore land directly into a trust Pembroke controls. Legally clean. Untouchable, unless someone with standing challenged it before the transfer completed. Someone with standing, the Duke repeated quietly. Such as a husband. Margaret stepped back from the door as though it had burned her. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake turning over every kindness he had shown her, every careful, unexplained condition of their arrangement, and found she could no longer tell where his rescue of her ended and his war against Pembroke began, or whether there had ever been a difference at all. Getting into Pembroke House was the easy part. Margaret had visited a dozen times as a girl, before her father's death had turned her from a welcome niece by courtesy into an inconvenience Pembroke merely tolerated. She still remembered the layout, the study at the end of the east corridor, the locked cabinet behind the desk where her guardian kept anything he did not wish a solicitor to find without warning. Getting out again with the records intact was another matter entirely. You should not be the one to go, the Duke said, for the 3rd time that evening, as they sat in the carriage 2 streets from Pembroke's townhouse. I am the only one who knows which papers are my father's, Margaret said. And the only one Pembroke won't think to search, because as far as he knows, I am still the frightened girl who signed whatever he put in front of her. The Duke's jaw tightened, but he did not argue further. He had learned, in the weeks since their wedding, that arguing with her once her mind was set was a battle not worth losing twice. The plan was simple enough. Clara would keep Pembroke occupied under the pretense of discussing wedding gifts still owed from the cancelled Carow match, a conversation guaranteed to keep him irritated and distracted for at least 20 minutes. Margaret would slip in through the servants' entrance, find the cabinet, and be gone before he ever knew she had set foot in the house. It nearly worked. She found the cabinet exactly where memory told her it would be, the lock no match for the thin blade Clara had pressed into her palm with instructions Margaret suspected came from a less respectable chapter of Clara's past than she'd ever admitted to. Her father's valuation records sat near the top, tied with the same ribbon her father had always used, and for a moment Margaret's hand stilled over them, grief rising sudden and sharp in a house that had once, briefly, felt like family. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor, too close, too fast. She had the papers against her chest and was reaching for the window latch when the study door opened. Margaret. Pembroke's voice was soft, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. How unexpected. He did not raise an alarm. He did not need to. He simply closed the door behind him and stood before it, blocking the only way out that did not involve a two-story drop. Give me the papers, he said, and perhaps I forget you were ever foolish enough to come here. You stole my father's estate. I managed your father's estate, as his will instructed. Your new husband's little investigation will find nothing but a guardian doing his duty. But something flickered behind his eyes, the first real fear Margaret had ever seen in him, quickly smothered beneath practiced calm. Give them to me. No. Pembroke moved toward her, and for one terrible moment Margaret understood, with total clarity, that she had badly misjudged how far a desperate man might go to protect himself. The window shattered before he reached her, not from outside, but from the Duke himself, who had climbed the trellis Margaret hadn't even known was there, glass raining across the study floor as he stepped through with a calm fury that made even Pembroke go still. Touch her, the Duke said quietly, and I promise you, the courts will be the least of your concerns. For a moment, no one in the study moved. Pembroke's eyes darted between them, the Duke, glass-flecked and immovable in the broken window frame, and Margaret, still clutching the ribbon-tied bundle of her father's records against her chest. Whatever calculation ran behind his eyes resolved, finally, into something colder than fear. You have nothing, Pembroke said, though his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. A set of valuations and the word of a woman I was well within my legal right to guardian. No court in England will unwind 3 years of settled transactions on so little. On its own, no, the Duke agreed. But paired with Denby's findings on the other 2 estates, and a magistrate who has been waiting 8 months for exactly this kind of corroborating evidence, I think you'll find the courts considerably more interested than you'd like. Something in Pembroke's face changed then, not surrender, but the swift, ugly calculation of a cornered man deciding what he still had left to lose. His hand moved toward the desk drawer. Pembroke, the Duke said, low and even. Think very carefully about what you reach for next. Pembroke's hand stopped an inch from the drawer. For 3 long seconds, nothing in the room moved but the curtain, stirring in the wind through the broken window. Then, all at once, whatever fight remained in him seemed to drain away, his shoulders dropping, the mask of the composed guardian collapsing into something smaller and far more desperate. I did what was necessary, he said, quieter now. Your father left debts, Margaret, debts you never knew about because I spent years quietly covering them so you would never have to. Was I meant to do that for nothing? You were meant to do your duty, Margaret said, not sell what remained of my inheritance to companies that trace back to your own name. He had no answer for that. There was none to give. It was not the Duke who summoned the constables, but Clara, slipping from the drawing room the moment she heard the glass break, running the 2 streets to where Denby waited with the magistrate already primed for exactly this eventuality. By the time the household staff had gathered, wide-eyed, in the corridor, Lord Pembroke was seated in his own study under guard, his face grey with the particular horror of a man watching a lifetime of careful theft unravel in a single night. But the victory, when it came, did not feel the way Margaret had imagined it would. Back at Ashford House, hours later, she sat by the fire in her room, her father's record still in her lap, and found herself crying, not from relief, but from something rawer, older, the accumulated grief of 3 years spent believing she had no one left who would fight for her. The Duke found her there near midnight. He did not ask if she was well, he could see plainly that she was not. He simply sat beside her, close but not touching, and let the silence hold whatever she was not yet ready to say. "I thought I had lost everything," she said finally. "My father. My home. My name, nearly, to a man I'd never have chosen. I told myself I had grown used to having no one." "You do have someone," the Duke said quietly. "Whatever this marriage began as, Margaret, that has not been true for some time." She looked up at him then, searching his face one final time for the calculation she had once been so certain she'd find there. She did not find it. There was only him, steady, unguarded, waiting. "Then don't let it end when Pembroke's case is closed," she said softly. For the first time since she had known him, the Duke of Ashford smiled without restraint. Lord Pembroke's trial concluded within the month. Denby's evidence, joined at last with Margaret's recovered records, left the magistrate no room for leniency. 3 ruined families were made whole again, and Pembroke's name became, in Yorkshire drawing-rooms, a cautionary tale rather than a threat. Margaret's father's lands were restored to her fully, though she chose, in the end, to fold them into the Ashford estate herself, not out of necessity this time, but out of the same quiet trust that had grown, unhurried, into something neither of them had planned for. The county still called him the most feared duke in England. But the servants at Ashford House had begun to notice something the wider world had not, the way he sought her out at the end of each day, the way her laughter had returned to rooms that had long stood silent. What began as 5 desperate words, and 5 careful ones in answer, had become the truest partnership either of them had known. "What would you have done in her place?"